After a day of rage in Egypt, President Mubarak declares a curfew across the whole country. The army are called out onto the streets. But protesters remain on the streets. The headquarters of the ruling party is on fire. The headquarters of Egyptian radio and television and the foreign ministry are surrounded. Nobel laureate and opposition figurehead Mohammed El-Baradei is put under house arrest, and the U.S. says it's deeply concerned about events.
These protests underscore that there are deep grievances within Egyptian society, and the Egyptian government needs to understand that violence will not make these grievances go away.
Welcome to BBC World News. I'm Pune Gadusi. Also coming up, our correspondents across Cairo are live in this program with the latest on a day of unprecedented protests. And we'll have all the international reaction on how world leaders are responding to a fast unraveling situation. Hello and welcome. Tens of thousands of protesters are on the streets of Egypt, clashing with riot police around the country. The fourth straight day of protests began after Friday prayers and brought a cross-section of Egyptian society onto the streets. Dozens of protesters have been injured in the clashes, and there are reports a woman was killed after being hit by a tear gas canister. A curfew is now in force in the major cities of Cairo, Alexandria and Suez, and later extended to the rest of the country. Mansoura and Ismailia are also reported to have seen angry anti-government protests on the street. In the capital, Cairo, major flashpoints have been on the 6th October bridge, outside the People's Assembly of Egypt. Thousands of protesters have also gathered in the city's huge central Tahrir Square after police attempts to keep the crowds out have failed. My colleague Wura Davis has been out on the streets in Cairo. Here's his report.
Here in Cairo, indeed across Egypt, there have been demonstrations and protests all day long between anti-government protesters and police. This is the fourth consecutive day of these violent demonstrations. People refusing orders to back down, refusing orders to go home. The authorities are doing everything they can to stop people coming out onto the streets. They've closed down mobile phone networks. There's no text messaging and the computer networks are completely closed down. But still, there have been thousands of people out on the streets of Cairo, out on the streets of Egypt today. This popular Arab uprising still very much alive here in Egypt and indeed across the rest of the Arab world.
A curfew was called 2 hours ago in the cities of Cairo, Alexandria and Suez. It was announced on state television.
Given the rioting, unlawful acts and destruction of government and private buildings, including some banks and hotels, President Hosni Mubarak, being the Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian Armed Forces, has declared a curfew starting 1800 Cairo time on Friday, the 28th of January 2011, until 0700 the next day, to be effective in the cities of Grand Cairo, Cairo and neighboring suburbs, Alexandria and Suez.
Well, that curfew has now been extended throughout the country. According to television reports, the Egyptian army leadership has decided to extend the curfew, which was originally only for the cities of Cairo, Suez and Alexandria, to the whole of the country. The state-owned Egyptian satellite TV Al Masriya reported that a few minutes ago. Joining me from Cairo is the BBC's Wura Davis. Wura, you're standing outside the burning headquarters of the party, of the ruling party. How does it look now?
It's incredible scenes here. I never thought I'd see this in Cairo. This is President Mubarak's governing headquarters, the headquarters of his ruling NPD party, and it is in flames. The building is gutted. It is surrounded by protesters. Some people are going in and taking things from the building, but this was a symbol of Mubarak's power, of Mubarak's regime, and the building is in flames. I can't describe the scenes here closely enough because buildings around me are on fire, cars are on fire, and the one group of people who've been protecting these buildings throughout the day, the army and the police, they're nowhere to be seen. The crowds have basically taken over the streets. Remember, there's a curfew meant to be in place now. Earlier on today, the police and the army were here. They've been running battles all day with the protesters, and they now have taken over the streets, and they are burning down those buildings that represent the regime of Hosni Mubarak.
Of course, those images are symbolic, but it's also a very dangerous situation. Has the building been evacuated, or are there any people in danger now?
There are no signs of people inside the building. Obviously tensions are high, and earlier the police were firing tear gas, rubber batons, and also buckshot, shotgun cartridges. But as I say, there is no sign of the police as we speak, no sign of the military. Mob rule has taken place. It is tense. There are problems, but we are getting hassled by some people. But this does feel like a national movement, a protest that is growing, and one wonders if the presidency can survive this moment.
It does sound really loud and noisy around you where you are, and that is despite a curfew which has been called at least 2 hours ago. How crowded is that place now?
There's lots of. But we're going to have to go. There's some gunfire at the minute, or something exploding, and it is getting very tense around us. I'm going to go now.
Okay, we'll let you go there. Wira Davis from the city centre in front of the burning building of the National Democratic Party headquarters in Cairo. Now, Yolanda Nell joins me from Cairo as well, live on television. Yolanda, what's the latest you have from the city centre?
Well, certainly what reports I've heard of tens of thousands of people still defying this curfew, as Wira was witnessing, have gathered in Tahrir Square, which has been the main point for demonstrators to gather also since earlier this week, since Tuesday, when we had the first day of rage to coincide with an Egyptian national holiday. We can smell tear gas still on the air here. Tear gas seems to have been used in very large quantities today. I've seen white clouds of it in the street. We've heard gunshots ringing out, and we were told earlier that the military was going to be moving in. It's of course very hard to verify now that it's dark exactly what force is being used on the streets, but it is clear that there are fires going on around the capital, and that government buildings in particular seem to be being targeted. Egyptian state television, the foreign ministry, people have gathered around these buildings for their big display of people power, as well as the ruling party's national headquarters.
Of course, it's late in the evening now, and there's been a curfew in place. It seems there are people still out on the streets. How are the security forces treating them?
Well, from here it's hard to say. Certainly during the day we've seen a lot of clashes between the security services, really quite a heavy-handed approach to what started off certainly as peaceful demonstrations. But what I've noticed, having spent 3 years based in Cairo, is this is a huge display of defiance on the part of the average Egyptian person, people who are taking part in these demonstrations. You have to remember, not only has the Interior Ministry made clear in the past week that demonstrations will not be allowed, but demonstrations are actually banned under emergency law, which has been in place in Egypt for about 30 years now. And people are turning out on the streets despite the fact that there is this very well-armed security force present there, and despite the fact that it's not allowed. And it seems to be that the fact that the numbers of people, this is a mega city after all of some 20 million people have taken heart in the fact that others are also coming out in large numbers, and they feel this gives them some protection.
And of course, all communications, telephone and internet, have apparently been disconnected, mobile phone systems as well. How has that affected the gatherings and the information even about the curfew for the people who are out on the streets?
Well, that's right, because information about the curfew came through on Egyptian state television. That's where it was announced, and the curfew's supposed to be in place here in Cairo, also in Alexandria and Suez, the cities where there's been some of the worst violence in the past few hours. But with mobile phone networks down, the message couldn't get through to everybody if they wanted to hear that message in the first place. Certainly we can verify that mobile phone networks have been down. That's affected everyone across the BBC working in Cairo and other parts of Egypt today. From late last night, SMS text messaging wasn't working. That's another tool that's used by opposition groups to help coordinate their activities. And social networking sites such as Twitter and Facebook have been blocked. That's been something that's happened a lot in the past few days. The first day of rage on Tuesday started as a Facebook invitation to people that quickly got tens of thousands of followers, and that's really how things started to pick up momentum.
Thank you, Yolande Nell, in the center of Cairo. A little earlier, in an interview on the Egyptian state television, General Abdul Monem Kato from the Egyptian Armed Forces voiced his reaction to the protests.
I've just heard there are people refusing to go home and break the curfew. What on earth are they doing? They need to understand. The message has been received. Now please wait for the response of the political authorities who will take the necessary steps. I'm sure President Mubarak will make decisions to benefit the Egyptian people. My message to the people, do not push us to use force with you.
And a little earlier, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said Egypt's government must stop the violence against the protesters.
We are deeply concerned about the use of violence by Egyptian police and security forces against protesters. And we call on the Egyptian government to do everything in its power to restrain the security forces. At the same time, protesters should also refrain from violence and express themselves peacefully. As we have repeatedly said, we support the universal human rights of the Egyptian people, including the right to freedom of expression, of association, and of assembly. We urge the Egyptian authorities to allow peaceful protests and to reverse the unprecedented steps it has taken to cut off communications. These protests underscore that there are deep grievances within Egyptian society, and the Egyptian government needs to understand that violence will not make these grievances go away. As President Obama said yesterday, reform is absolutely critical to the well-being of Egypt.
That was U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton speaking at the White House a little while ago. Another citizen of Cairo, Heba, can see the flames of the burning headquarters from her house. Heba, tell us what's going on. What can you see from where you are?
Earlier there was quite a bit of fires going on near the headquarters. Actually, it is the flames from the headquarters of the party, and they're still ongoing. And I see there are cars and still people on the October Bridge, which is surprising because there is supposed to be a curfew.
How does that make you feel, seeing those very powerful images right next to your home in the center of the city?
I think it's a historic moment in the history of my nation, and I'm a positive person, and I hope it's for the best for our people who have suffered for a very long time. And I am very proud of all the young people who were so courageous, and they were able to face the police and aggression on them. I'm really amazed at their courage.
Have you felt safe to leave your home? Have you seen what's happening on the streets today at all?
I've seen from my window. I couldn't leave. I have an invalid mother, and I couldn't leave her. But I have a network with some friends of mine who have been to the demonstrations, and it is a historic time in our nation.
Thank you, Heba, a citizen of Cairo, speaking to us on the phone. Let's go back live to Lise Doucette on the rooftop of the BBC building in the center of the city in Cairo. Lise, it's getting darker and darker, but the fire is still ablaze up there.
Darker and darker, and I have to say, Pune, that in the last half hour, this confrontation, the running battles we saw all through the day between the police and the protesters has entered a more deadly phase. You can hear perhaps the sound of helicopters clattering in the night sky. They have never deployed military helicopters here before to contend with protests. We've been hearing the constant sound of gunfire coming from the area along a critical avenue running along the Nile, which is where the Information Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, the Egyptian State Television and Radio are based. And there was a huge explosion that reverberated right across Cairo a short time ago. The army, whom the President and Commander-in-Chief ordered onto the streets,
are now deploying more deadly weapons, and that we're just gathering from what we've been hearing here in Cairo tonight. And about half an hour ago, hundreds of demonstrators just marched past, defying the curfew on the avenue just below our offices here, heading towards that central area of Cairo, close to Tahrir Square. Ironically, that means Liberation Square, which has been the focal point of protest. And so, even though President Mubarak wanted the army to help the police, the riot police, to restore order, they haven't done it yet.
What are the people feeling about Hillary Clinton's State Department comments about what's happening in Egypt? There has been no official reaction from the government, but what are the people saying about it?
Well, a lot of people are waiting here to see what the Egyptian government says. We had reports earlier that the President Hosni Mubarak would address the nation. He still hasn't. Egyptian people want to know what he's thinking. What is he going to say in response to these protests? I spoke to some people who are close to the President and to his aides. They say the President is listening to the streets. But what is his answer after 4 days of these unprecedented rage? We do know that he has had talks with the American leaders, and I have to say Egyptians expect a lot of Americans, and I have to say they also seem very disappointed. $1.3 billion has been going to Egypt from the United States for many years, principally because Washington regards Cairo as a key player in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and a stabilizing, moderating influence across this region. And therefore, I think they expect a lot of the United States, and they've been disappointed that the kind of confused language coming out of Washington. They want to support President Mubarak, but they also want to be seen to be supporting what Hillary Clinton called the legitimate grievances of the people on the street. So tonight Hillary Clinton called for dialogue, she called for restraint, she called for peaceful protests.
Thank you, Liz Doucet there in Cairo. You're watching BBC World News. Still to come, as President Hosni Mubarak's rule in Egypt comes under international scrutiny, we have the assessment of Middle East envoy Tony Blair.